The coastlines of Europe did not change slowly. They changed overnight. One morning a monastery stood at the water's edge. The next morning it was ash and silence. But that story, the story of fire and raid, is only the beginning. The real story is what came after the raid stopped and the settlers stayed. The Vikings did not appear from nowhere. They came from Scandinavia, from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, from a landscape of narrow fjords, thin soil, and a coastline that had been teaching people to read the sea for generations. By the late 8th century, the pressure of population growth, inheritance disputes, and political competition at home was pushing people outward. The sea was not an obstacle. It was the road they all. To understand what made Viking migration different from everything that came before it, you have to start with the ships. The Viking longship was not simply a boat. It was a technological achievement that had no equal anywhere in the world at that moment. Shallow enough to beach directly on a coastline without a harbor. Narrow enough to navigate rivers deep inland. Fast enough under sail or oar to outrun anything pursuing it. Flexible enough in its clinker-built hull to flex with ocean waves, rather than break against them. A longship could cross the open North Atlantic. It could sail up the Seine into the heart of Francia. It could navigate the rivers of Eastern Europe all the way to Constantinople. The same vessel that raided a monastery on the Irish coast could be dragged overland between rivers and relaunched on the other side. This was not luck, it was engineering. And it gave the people who built and sailed these ships a mobility that no coastal community in Europe was prepared to defend against. The first recorded raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 AD was not an isolated event. It was the opening note of a movement that would not stop for 300 years. And what made it terrifying was not just the violence, it was the speed. Communities had no warning, no time to prepare, no ability to predict where the next crossing would land. The image of the Viking raider is real, but it is incomplete. Within a generation of the first raids, something else was happening alongside the violence. Settlers were arriving, traders were establishing routes, families were crossing the sea not to burn but to build. In the Scottish Islands, Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, Norse settlers arrived and stayed. They built farmsteads in the same pattern they had used at home. Longhouses oriented against the wind, animals and people sharing warmth in the same building. The same agricultural habits carried across the water and planted in new soil. In Ireland, the Norse founded the first true towns the island had ever seen. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick. These were not raid camps. They were trading centers, deliberately positioned at river mouths and natural harbors, designed to move goods between the Norse world and the wider European and Eastern trade networks. In northern Francia, a Viking leader named Rollo negotiated a formal settlement with the Frankish king in 911 AD. The land given to him and his followers would become Normandy, named directly for the Northmen who settled it. Within 2 generations, those settlers had adopted the local language, the local religion, and the local political structures. Yet they retained something of the restless ambition that had brought them there. This pattern repeated across the Viking world. Raiders became settlers. Settlers became rulers. Rulers became integrated into the very societies they had once threatened. To understand why people left Scandinavia, the Scandinavian landscape in the Viking Age was not one of grand halls and feasting warriors. For most people, it was a life of subsistence farming in narrow valleys, fishing in cold fjords, and the constant pressure of short growing seasons and long dark winters. Farmsteads were the basic unit of society. A longhouse, a long rectangular timber or turf building, served as home for the family, shelter for the animals, and workspace for everything that kept a household alive through winter. Inside, the central hearth ran the length of the building. Cattle and horses occupied one end. The family lived and slept at the other. The body heat of the animals was not incidental. It was part of the winter survival strategy. Food was barley, oats, rye, preserved fish, dried or salted, dairy products from cattle and goats. Meat with ale was safer to drink than water and was brewed continuously. The smell of every Norse farmstead was smoke, animal dung, fermenting grain, and damp wool. Inheritance law drove migration as directly as any adventure. Under Norse custom, land passed to the eldest son. Younger sons received little or nothing. In a landscape where good farmland was already scarce, this meant that with every generation, a new group of young men faced a choice: accept poverty at home or find land somewhere else. The sea made somewhere else a real option. This is why the migrations were not random. They were structural, built into the society by the logic of inheritance, land scarcity, and a seafaring tradition that made distance meaningless. Viking migration did not go in one direction. It went in every direction simultaneously. Westward from Norway, settlers reached the Faroe Islands by the early 9th century. Iceland was settled from approximately 870 AD, within a generation becoming a functioning society of several thousand people with its own legal assembly. The Althing, established in 930 AD, one of the earliest parliamentary structures in history. From Iceland, the movement continued. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, sailed west and reached Greenland around 980. He returned with settlers. A Norse colony in Greenland survived for nearly 500 years before disappearing, a fact that still puzzles historians. And beyond Greenland, around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson reached North America. The site at Lalance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, excavated in the 1960s, confirms Norse presence in the Americas 5 centuries before Columbus. They did not stay, but eastward from Sweden, a different movement was underway. Norse traders and warriors moved into the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They established trading posts, founded settlements, and eventually gave their name, the Rus, to the region and its people. The Varangian trade routes connected Scandinavia to Byzantium and the Islamic world, moving furs, slaves, amber, and honey southward and returning with silver, silk, and spices. Southward from Denmark, the movement into England, Francia, and the Mediterranean followed a different logic again. More politically calculated, more interested in territory and tribute than pure trade. In England, Viking migration went through distinct phases. The first phase was raiding. Coastal monasteries, lightly defended and wealthy, were the primary targets. Lindisfarne in 793 AD, Jarrow shortly after, Iona repeatedly. These were not strategic military campaigns. They were fast, targeted extractions of portable wealth, silver, gold, slaves, carried out by small groups who were back at sea before any organized response could reach them. The second phase was a different matter entirely. In 865 AD, a large Danish force that the English sources called the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. This was not a raid. It was an invasion with the explicit intention of conquest and settlement. Within a decade, this force had destroyed 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia all fell or were severely weakened. Only Wessex survived, under its King Alfred, who fought the Danes to a standstill and negotiated the division of England along a boundary that became known as the Danelaw. North and east of that line, Danish law, Danish customs, and Danish settlers. South and west, Anglo-Saxon England under Alfred's authority. The Danelaw was not just a political boundary, it was a cultural and linguistic one. Place names ending in by Thorpe and Thwaite, Grimsby, Scunthorpe, Braithwaite, are Danish. They mark the geography of Viking settlement as clearly as any written record. The dialects of northern England carried Norse vocabulary into the modern period. The very word they, the third-person plural pronoun of modern English, came into the language from Old Norse. Strip away the mythology, and what you find in Viking settlements is a world that was practical, organized, and deeply concerned with the same things that concerned every early medieval society: survival, status, and belonging. The excavations at Jorvik, the Viking city beneath modern York, give us the clearest picture of what a Norse urban settlement actually looked like. Timber buildings packed tightly together along narrow lanes, workshops producing leather goods, textiles, metalwork, and bone combs, a trading economy that brought in goods from as far as Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates, silk, spices, coins, glass. The streets were narrow and organic. The smell would have been overwhelming by modern standards: organic waste, animal dung, wood smoke, and the particular smell of a leather tanning operation that archaeological evidence confirms was operating within the settlement itself. Personal appearance mattered significantly. Viking Age graves and settlements consistently produce fine, tooth combs, tweezers, ear scoops, and razors. The image of the unwashed barbarian is contradicted directly by the archaeological record. Norse literature describes regular bathing. Saturday was called Lafgardar washing day, and the account of the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Norse traders on the Volga in 922 AD, describes them as the filthiest people he had ever seen in one breath, and mentions their communal grooming practices in the next, suggesting that cleanliness operated by different standards than his own. Food in Norse settlements was barley bread, preserved fish, dairy, and seasonal meat, ale and mead, wooden and soapstone vessels, iron tools, bone and antler objects produced in dedicated craft workshops. Social hierarchy was visible in everything, in the quality of weapons buried with the dead, in the size of a man's haul, in the number of ships he could put to sea, and in the generosity with which he rewarded his followers. The Viking world did not stay pagan. Christianity spread through Norse settlements by a combination of political calculation and genuine conversion. In England, the treaty between Alfred and the Danish leader Guthrum in 878 AD included Guthrum's baptism. In Normandy, Rollo's settlement came with a condition of Christian conversion. In Iceland, Christianity was formally adopted by the Althing around the year 1000 AD, a decision made by legal assembly rather than conquest, which was itself a remarkably Norse way of changing religion. The conversion was rarely clean. Older beliefs persisted beneath Christian surfaces. Thor's hammer amulets and Christian crosses were sometimes worn together. Burial practices shifted gradually from furnished pagan graves to Christian interment. The process took generations and looked different in every region, but the long-term consequence was the same everywhere. Christian conversion connected Norse communities to the wider network of European literacy, law, and culture. Monasteries were founded. Written records began to be kept. The sagas, the extraordinary literary tradition of Iceland, were written down in the 12th and 13th centuries by Christian monks recording an oral tradition that stretched back to the Viking Age itself. What Christianity did for the Viking world was what it had done for the Anglo-Saxon world before it. It provided institutional stability, written law, and a shared framework that allowed scattered settlements to become coherent societies. The long-term legacy of Viking migration is everywhere, even when it is not visible. In the British Isles, it is in the place names, in the legal vocabulary, in the genetic record, and in the dialects of the North. In Normandy, it is in the political ambition that would produce the Norman conquest of 1066 itself, one of the most consequential Viking descended events in European history. In Russia, it is in the name of the nation itself and in the trade networks that connected Northern Europe to Byzantium. In Iceland, it is in the Althing, still functioning today as the world's oldest parliament. In North America, it is in the quiet evidence of a Norse camp in Newfoundland that nobody noticed for 1,000 years. But the most important legacy is not in any single place. It is in what these migrations demonstrated about the capacity of human movement to reshape the world. The Vikings did not set out to transform Europe. They set out to find silver, land, and opportunity. They crossed seas that other people did not dare to cross. They navigated rivers that other people did not know how to use. They arrived in places that had no defenses against people who moved the way they moved. And then, generation by generation, settlement by settlement, they stopped moving and started belonging. In Dublin, in York, in Normandy, in Kiev, in Reykjavik, in Greenland, the pattern was the same. The raider became a farmer. The outsider became a neighbor. The migrant became the ancestor. The North Atlantic did not divide their world. It was their world. And through it, they connected the edges of the medieval earth in ways that no power before them had managed, and none after them would replicate for centuries. The longships are gone. The settlements they founded are cities. The languages they carried are embedded in the languages spoken today, and the coastlines of Europe still bear the marks of a people who arrived fast, stayed long, and changed everything.